The desert was merciless. 2 little girls, a dying mother, and a man who never expected to become a hero. What he did next didn't just save them, it changed everything. Where did you watch this story? Let us know in the comments, and if stories like this move you, subscribe now. Now, watch closely, because this is a tale you won't forget. The sun was cruel that day, hanging heavy above the desert like a blade poised to cut the world in half. Heat shimmered across the horizon, turning stone into liquid mirages and sand into waves that seemed to roll without end. I had been riding since dawn, the taste of dust on my tongue, the weight of silence pressing harder than the saddle beneath me. Days like that stripped a man down to his bones, left nothing but endurance and the stubborn will to keep moving. I thought I knew the worst the desert could give. I thought I'd seen every kind of emptiness. But I was wrong. I spotted them first as shadows, small shapes staggering against the glare, fragile and out of place in a land that chewed men alive. At first, I thought my eyes deceived me, another trick of heat rising off the flats. Yet as I drew closer, the truth came into focus. 2 little girls, barefoot, their dresses torn ragged, their skin blistered by the sun. They moved together, swaying as if one would fall without the other, their small hands locked so tightly it seemed pain itself bound them. No child belonged out there. No soul should. And yet there they were, walking through a wilderness that had already claimed stronger lives than theirs. I reined my horse to a stop, watching them for a moment that stretched longer than it should have. I had no kin, no family waiting for me back home. Years of solitude had taught me to keep my distance from the troubles of others. But there was something in the sight of those girls, something raw and wordless, that stirred an ache I could not turn away from. They looked too close to breaking, too close to disappearing into the dust like so many forgotten lives before them. Their lips were cracked, their faces streaked with dried tears and grit. I could see how their small chests rose in shallow breaths, hear the faint wheeze carried on the wind. They shouldn't have been alive at all, not after days beneath a sky like that. Still, they clung to each other, as though the strength of one kept the other from slipping into the earth. I dismounted slowly, careful not to startle them. They shrank back as I approached, eyes wide with the memory of cruelty. I had no need for words. I only uncapped my canteen and held it out. At first they hesitated, as if expecting a blow instead of mercy. But thirst won the battle, and when I tilted the water to their lips, they drank with a desperate greed that cut deeper than any cry. The water spilled down their chins, their small bodies trembling with every swallow, but they drank until they could drink no more. I steadied them, felt the fragility of their bones through the weight of my hands, and knew they had been close to vanishing forever. It was then I saw the direction of their gaze. Not just at me, but beyond, toward a cluster of scrub and stone where the desert bent into shadow. I followed their trembling fingers and understood. They had not wandered alone. Someone waited. Someone they feared to leave behind. I lifted them onto my horse, their thin arms clinging to me with a trust that frightened me for the responsibility it carried. Then I walked, leading the animal toward the place they had pointed. Beneath the crooked frame of a dying mesquite tree, I found her, a woman, dark-haired, her body laid low against the ground, skin ashen beneath the fever's fire. She tried to rise when my shadow fell across her, tried to shield the girls with what little strength she had left, but her body betrayed her. She collapsed back with a sound no louder than a sigh, and I knew death had already begun to trace its fingers along her. I knelt, touched her brow, and felt the heat that told me she had not long. But her eyes opened, faint and full of fear, and I saw in them the same plea the girls had carried, a plea for mercy in a world that had shown them none. In that moment, my choice was no choice at all. I gathered her into my arms, light as a bird, fragile as dry leaves in autumn, and set her on the horse with her daughters. She swayed, but the girls clutched at her as though their embrace alone could keep her tethered to life. Step by step, I led them back across the flats, the horizon trembling in the heat. The desert pressed in, vast and unforgiving, yet each mile carried the weight of something more than duty. It felt as though I was not guiding them, but being guided myself, toward something I could not yet name, toward a burden perhaps, but also a kind of purpose I had long forgotten. By the time the low outline of my ranch rose from the haze, my shirt clung with sweat, my throat burned raw, but I did not falter. The girls stirred when they saw the cabin, their eyes widening as if they had stumbled upon a fortress instead of a weathered home held together by stubborn hands. To me, it had always been a place of silence, a shelter from the world I had left behind. But to them, I saw in their faces, it was something more. It was a promise. Inside, I settled the children with bread soft enough for their small hands to tear, wrapped them in quilts worn by years of use. They ate hungrily, though their eyes kept darting to the door, as though fear might still follow them inside. I tended to their mother, laying her near the fire, crushing herbs I'd gathered on my rides and mixing them into a bitter draught that I pressed against her lips. She resisted at first, but desperation won, and she swallowed weakly, her breath shuddering with the effort. That night I sat by her side, listening to the crackle of flames and the restless whispers of fever. The girls slept close together, their small bodies curled like sparrows, their trust placed wholly in a stranger they had met on the edge of death. I did not sleep. I watched the firelight flicker across their faces, and for the first time in years, I felt something stirring in the silence. Not peace, not yet, but the beginning of it. When morning came, her fever broke. Her eyes opened, dark and uncertain, finding me still there. She looked to her daughters first, then back to me. I said nothing. There was no need for words. The truth was already there, plain as the desert itself. No one should be left to die in the dust. The days that followed felt unlike any I had known before. For years the ranch had stood silent, the only sound the scrape of wind across the plains, the groan of wood settling in the night, the steady rhythm of my own breath in the solitude. I had grown used to it, convinced myself silence was enough. But now silence had been broken, not with noise, but with life, with the small movements of children padding across the floor, with the shallow, uneven breaths of a woman fighting her way back from the edge of death. The stillness I had once guarded felt changed, filled now with something fragile yet persistent, like the first green shoot daring to rise in cracked soil. Her fever eased slowly, each day pulling her a little further from the brink. I tended to her in the only ways I knew, cooling her brow, coaxing broth between her lips, grinding herbs I had carried for months without ever needing. Sometimes she drifted in restless sleep, her lips moving with words I could not catch. Other times her eyes would open suddenly, darting with fear, as if the room itself might betray her. Always, they searched for the girls first. Only when she saw them near did her breathing soften. The children clung to her in every waking moment, their small bodies pressing close, their hands always reaching for hers. When they slept, it was often curled against her side, their dark hair tangled across her shawl, their breaths shallow but steady. I watched them from a distance, not wishing to intrude on their fragile closeness, but unable to turn away from the sight. There was a strength in it, a strength born not of comfort but of surviving pain together. The girls were slow to trust me. At first they kept their distance, moving like shadows along the walls, their wide eyes following me wherever I went. When I set bread before them, they hesitated before reaching, as if expecting it to be snatched away. When I drew water, they drank quickly, glancing to be sure it would not be taken back. I did not press them. Trust could not be demanded, only offered again and again until it found a place to settle. So I gave them what I had, food, warmth, and the steadiness of presence. Over time, their fear began to loosen its grip. One morning, as I repaired a saddle strap near the fire, I felt the smallest weight press against my side. I looked down to see one of the girls, her hair wild from sleep, leaning against me without a word. She stayed there only a moment before darting back to her mother, but it was enough. Enough to tell me that walls were beginning to crack. The woman herself, Nieli, as I came to know her name, spoke little at first. Her voice was roughened by fever, her words broken by weakness, yet every syllable carried the edge of caution. She had been shown too much cruelty to surrender trust easily. Her eyes held a wary distance, even as she allowed me to tend her wounds. Sometimes I caught her watching me in silence, as though trying to decide whether my kindness hid some deeper cost. I did not fault her for it. Life had carved suspicion deep into her, and it would not fade overnight. Yet I noticed how she began to accept small things without flinching. The bowl of broth placed in her hands, the blanket tucked around her shoulders, the steady presence beside her when fever dreams threatened to drag her under. She never asked why I did it, never spoke of gratitude, but her silence carried its own weight. I did not need words. Actions would be enough. The ranch itself seemed to shift beneath their presence. The girls found corners I had long ignored, an old quilt folded in the loft, a forgotten box of trinkets left behind by hands long gone. They laughed quietly at first, their voices hushed, as though afraid too much joy might summon punishment. But laughter nonetheless. The sound was strange in those walls, yet it settled into me like warmth after cold rain. I had forgotten how empty the place had truly been until they filled it with such simple life. At night, when the desert cooled and the stars burned sharp overhead, I sometimes stepped outside to breathe the air. I would look back at the cabin, the glow of firelight spilling faintly through the cracks, the silhouettes of 3 lives moving within. For years I had thought of the ranch as a refuge for one man alone, a place where the world could not intrude. Now, watching the flicker of their shadows, I wondered if it had been waiting all along, for them, or for what they represented. But shadows of fear still lingered. I saw it in Nieli's eyes when she startled at sudden sounds, in the way the girls sometimes clutched at her skirts with sudden panic, their breaths quickening as if remembering some unseen threat. They had been driven into the wilderness by hands that should have sheltered them. Such wounds did not heal with bread and water. They lingered, coiled tight beneath the surface, ready to strike when memory grew too near. I did not know their whole story then, not the names of those who had cast them out, not the full measure of their cruelty. I knew only what I saw, the marks left behind, the weight they carried in their silence. And though I did not say it aloud, I made a quiet vow beneath the desert stars. If cruelty came again, it would find me standing in its path. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon in streaks of fire, I stood at the edge of the corral, watching the girls chase a stray chicken across the yard. Their laughter rang brighter than it ever had before, echoing against the barn walls. Nieli sat nearby, wrapped in a shawl, her strength still fragile, but her eyes softer than I had yet seen them. For the first time, I allowed myself to wonder if this place, once nothing more than a lonely refuge, might hold something more, something worth protecting not just for myself, but for them. And yet, even as hope began to rise, I felt the weight of a truth I could not shake. The desert never forgets, and the past, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of finding its way back across the sand. The desert has a way of measuring time differently than anywhere else. Days do not pass so much as they endure. Each sunrise feels like the birth of something relentless, and each sunset a small mercy, a reprieve from the weight of the sun's glare. Yet in those weeks that followed, I felt time bending in ways I had not known for years. Where once the hours had stretched empty, filled only with the work of keeping a ranch alive, now they were marked by the rhythms of others, by the sound of children's footsteps on packed earth, by the voice of a woman coaxing life back into her body one breath at a time. I noticed the changes first in the girls. At the beginning they were quiet shadows, moving carefully, as though any wrong step might bring punishment. They had learned early that joy was dangerous, that attention often came in the form of cruelty. But children, no matter how scarred, carry within them an ember that refuses to die. Slowly, that ember began to glow again. At first it was in fleeting moments, a smile quickly hidden, a laugh that slipped past their lips before fear chased it back into silence. Then the moments grew longer. I would see them chasing each other across the yard, hair flying behind them like dark banners, their bare feet quick against the earth. I would hear their laughter echo across the barn, light as bird song, fragile yet stubborn. There were mornings when they followed me into the corral, their small hands busy brushing the horse's mane, their faces solemn with the pride of duty. They took to the animal with a reverence that told me they understood what he had meant on the day I found them. To them, he was more than a beast. He was the creature who had carried them from death into life again. I watched them run their hands down his flank with wide-eyed devotion, and for the first time in years I felt my own chest tighten with something close to pride. Nieli too began to change, though hers was a slower journey. Her strength returned like the slow filling of a riverbed after drought. At first she could barely sit upright without trembling, her shawl drawn tightly around her as though it alone could keep her from breaking. But each sunrise added a little more to her. She began to move through the cabin with measured steps, gathering herbs I had stored, stitching torn clothes with careful fingers. I often found her near the small patch of earth beside the cabin, coaxing the stubborn soil into surrendering green life. It seemed impossible that such dry ground could yield anything, yet under her touch even the desert bent a little. Still, shadows clung to her. At night I would hear her stir suddenly, her breath catching as though pulled from some nightmare. Sometimes she rose quietly, standing by the fire with her shawl wrapped close, staring into the flames as if seeking answers she could not speak. I did not disturb her in those moments. She carried her past like a wound that had not yet scarred over, raw and tender. To force words from her would only reopen it. So I gave her space, but remained close enough that she never woke to silence alone. It struck me then how much the desert had carved into her life, just as it had carved into mine. We were both creatures of endurance, shaped by loss, tempered by cruelty. Yet where I had chosen solitude as my shelter, she had been denied even that choice. She had been driven into exile, abandoned not by strangers but by blood. That kind of betrayal cuts deeper than the wilderness ever could. And though she never told me the full story in those days, I could read enough in the way she flinched at sudden sounds, in the way her hands sometimes shook when her daughters strayed too far from her sight. As for me, I found myself unsettled by their presence. For years I had lived with only the sound of wind and the creak of wood for company. My days had been marked by chores and silence, my nights by the lonely comfort of fire. I had convinced myself that was all I needed. Yet with them near, I discovered how thin that life had truly been. The girls' laughter filled corners of the ranch I had forgotten existed. Nieli's quiet movements gave the cabin a warmth I had never been able to kindle alone. Their very presence unsettled the solitude I had built like walls around myself. And though part of me feared it, another part, older, truer, welcomed it with a hunger I had not admitted until then. One evening, as I mended a post at the edge of the corral, I paused to watch them. The girls were chasing each other in the fading light, their shouts bright as the sun sank behind the ridges. Nieli sat on the porch, her shawl gathered around her shoulders, her gaze fixed on them with a softness that spoke of both love and fear. She looked fragile still, yet there was a fire behind her eyes, the fire of a woman who had refused to surrender even when the world demanded it. I realized then how much she had endured to still be alive, to still keep her children breathing against the odds. And in that moment, as the desert darkened around us and the first stars began to pierce the sky, I felt something I had not in years, belonging, not to a place, but to the fragile thread that bound us all together. I had not asked for it. I had not sought it. Yet it had come, uninvited, undeniable, like rain falling on dry ground. But the desert does not give without taking. It tests, it waits, and it remembers. As I watched the fragile peace forming in that yard, I could not shake the quiet certainty that the past was not done with them. Somewhere beyond those ridges, beyond the silence of the horizon, the cruelty that had cast them into the wilderness still lived. And when it came, as I knew it would have to decide once more what kind of man I truly was. The desert was a place of testing. Always had been, always would be. It wore a man down to his essence, stripping away all but what was unbreakable. I had lived with that truth so long I had almost forgotten what it was to share it with others. Yet now, with 3 new lives bound to mine, the desert seemed different. Less empty, though no less cruel. It gave me more reason to endure, and at the same time, more to fear losing. The girls thrived with a speed that startled me. Where once their faces had been hollow, their eyes dulled by hunger and heat, now colour returned to their cheeks, and laughter spilled from their lips as freely as water from a spring. They ran barefoot across the yard, their shouts chasing chickens and scattering dust. I would catch them climbing the old fence, daring each other to balance along its worn posts as though the ground itself were some great adventure. They were children again, if only in fragments pieced together by the safety they had not known before. Nieli watched them always with a gaze that carried both joy and sorrow. Her strength returned in careful increments. She moved through the cabin with more confidence, gathering wood, stitching clothes, tending to the small patch of soil she had claimed for a garden. Yet beneath her steady hands I saw the shadow of doubt. She never let the girls out of sight for long, and when they strayed too far she called them back with a tone sharper than she meant, fear hidden behind every word. At night she still woke with sudden starts, her breath ragged, her eyes wide as if expecting the walls themselves to betray her. I did not speak of it. Words were not the cure for wounds carved so deep. Instead, I showed her what I could: steadiness, consistency, the quiet truth that kindness need not be bartered or earned. I shared what food I had before I took any myself. I worked the land and split wood, not because I expected gratitude, but because it was what had to be done. And day by day, I saw her eyes soften, the distance between us shrinking not by declarations but by proof. Still, the land whispered warnings. The desert has its own way of carrying sound. A far-off rider can be heard long before he is seen, the beat of hooves carried across empty flats like a drum echoing in a canyon. More than once I thought I heard such sounds, faint but distinct, rising out of the horizon. I would step out onto the porch, the sun a red wound in the sky, scanning the distance until the shadows blurred together. Nothing ever came of it, yet unease settled in my bones. The past had a way of following, and I knew the cruelty that had cast Nieli and her daughters out was not the kind that stayed buried. One evening, I was mending a fence post near the corral when I caught Nieli watching me. She sat with her shawl wrapped around her shoulders, the girls tumbling in the yard beside her. Her eyes lingered not just on the work, but on me, as though she was searching for something more than she dared name. I kept to my task, letting the silence stretch between us. Some truths did not need to be forced. They revealed themselves in time, like water wearing through stone. That night, beneath the sweep of stars, I found myself restless. The girls slept curled together by the hearth, their faces peaceful in the glow of embers. Nieli sat awake, staring into the fire, her hands wrapped tight in her shawl. For a long time neither of us spoke. The crackle of flames and the low howl of wind through the cracks filled the space between. At last she said, barely above a whisper, that she did not know how long peace could last. She did not look at me when she said it, but I could hear the truth behind it, the fear that cruelty might return at any moment to shatter what little we had built. I did not answer her with promises. Promises are cheap things in a land where survival itself is never certain. Instead, I let my presence be the answer. I stoked the fire higher, kept watch through the long hours, and when the night stretched darkest, I stepped outside to breathe the cool air and scan the horizon once more. The land was silent, but silence was rarely permanent. In the weeks that followed, that unease grew sharper. I found signs on the edge of the property, hoofprints pressed deep in the sand where no rider should have been, a broken branch along the arroyo that told of someone passing where the wind alone could not have caused it. They were small things, but together they painted a picture I could not ignore. Someone had been near. Someone had watched. I said nothing to Nieli. Fear was already a shadow she carried too heavily. But I kept my rifle closer, oiled and ready, and I rode the edges of the property each morning, scanning the ridges and gullies for movement. The land itself felt tense, as though holding its breath. And yet, amid that quiet dread, life persisted. The girls began to laugh more freely, their voices carrying bright into the air. Nieli's strength grew each day, her steps surer, her hands steadier. The ranch that had once been little more than a lonely shelter now pulsed with a fragile kind of life, fragile but real. I knew, deep in my bones, that the peace could not last forever. But watching them, hearing the sound of small feet pounding across the yard, seeing Nieli's eyes shine in the fading light, I also knew this. If the past came riding back across the desert, it would not find them alone this time. The desert never keeps its silence for long. I had felt it building for weeks. Those faint hoofprints near the arroyo, the broken branches along the ridges, the way the wind seemed to carry echoes that did not belong to it. I told myself it could be chance, some passing drifter, but deep down I knew better. Cruelty does not vanish into dust. It circles back, like a vulture waiting for the right moment to descend. The day they came began like any other. The sun climbed slow but merciless, burning the sky white by noon. I was working in the corral, tightening the last of the railings, while the girls played nearby, their laughter carrying bright against the dry air. Nieli sat on the porch, her shawl pulled close though the heat was heavy, her gaze following her daughters with the steady attention of a mother who could not forget what it was to lose everything. Then came the sound. Hoofbeats, not faint this time, but rolling strong across the flats, stirring the dust long before the riders came into view. The girls froze mid-chase, their heads snapping toward the horizon. Nieli stiffened, her hand clutching the porch rail until her knuckles whitened. I felt it in my chest too, a weight that settled like stone. Two figures broke from the shimmer of heat, riding hard. Their shapes sharpened as they drew closer, men broad in the shoulders, their faces cut harsh by sun and spite. They carried themselves with the ease of men who had never been denied, whose cruelty was second nature. Even before they reined their horses at the edge of the yard, I saw in Nieli's eyes that she knew them. Her breath hitched sharp, and she pressed a hand to her chest as though struck. The girls scrambled to her side, burying themselves in her skirts, their small bodies trembling. I moved instinctively, setting myself between porch and riders, my shadow long against the dust. They dismounted with the swagger of men who believed the land itself bent to their will. Spurs clinked against the dry earth, hands resting near their belts in a gesture meant less for comfort than for threat. One of them, the older by the lines etched deep into his face, spat into the dust before speaking. His voice was gravel, bitter with disdain. He called Nieli's name, not with care, but with the weight of ownership. I felt the girls press tighter against their mother, heard the sharp hitch of Nieli's breath. She tried to stand, tried to rise as though to shield them even in her fear, but her knees faltered, and she clung to the porch rail for balance. I stepped forward, my stance calm but immovable, the fence line of my body drawn between them and her. "You left them to die," I said, my voice low, steady. "You'll not touch them again." They sneered, their faces twisting with something between amusement and rage. One shifted his weight, his hand brushing the worn handle of the pistol at his hip, not yet drawing, but close enough to speak the language of threat. I did not move for mine. Violence was not my first choice, nor my last, but I let my stillness tell them what they needed to know. If they forced my hand, they would not leave whole. The moment stretched taut as a drawn bowstring. Dust swirled at our feet, the girl's sobs muffled against Nieli's skirts, the horses stamping restlessly behind their masters. For a breath it seemed the desert itself was waiting, holding still for what might break loose. But cruelty thrives on weakness, and I gave them none. My stance, my silence, my gaze that did not falter, it unnerved them in ways my gun could not. They muttered curses, spitting venom into the air, their pride bristling at being denied. At last, with movements sharp and angry, they mounted again, their eyes promising this was not the end. They rode off in a storm of dust, the sound of their hooves fading but not gone from memory. Only when the silence returned did I hear Nieli collapse to her knees, trembling. Tears spilled unchecked down her face as the weight of fear gave way. The girls clung to her, their sobs breaking into the hot air. I stepped closer, crouched beside her, and laid a hand gently on her shoulder, not as possession, not as command, but as steadying comfort. She lifted her gaze to mine, and for the first time I saw not just fear but something else. Recognition, perhaps, that she was not alone in this fight anymore. That night the ranch carried a different kind of silence. The girls slept uneasily, twitching with dreams too heavy for children. Nieli sat awake long past midnight, her eyes reflecting the flames as though she saw again the faces of those who had returned to haunt her. I sat across from her, my rifle leaned within arm's reach, my ears tuned to every whisper of wind. Words passed between us unspoken. This peace was fragile, and cruelty would come again. When it did, the desert would bear witness to where I stood. The desert teaches many lessons. That day it taught me this. Some silences are not empty. They are filled with the weight of promises unspoken, with the quiet oath of a man who has chosen to stand between the innocent and the cruelty of the world. The Blackthorn brothers did not ride far. Men like that never did. They lingered in the desert's shadows, not gone, only circling. And from that day forward the ranch was no longer just a place of healing. It became a place under siege. The first signs were small, yet deliberate. A fence post split clean where no storm had blown. A calf cut loose from the corral, its tracks scattering into the scrub as though driven off. Water barrels overturned in the night, spilling their contents into dust. Each act alone could have been chance, but together they spelled intent. I rose earlier, worked later, and kept my rifle closer. The girls noticed the change, though I tried to mask it with routine. They laughed still, but their play was edged with unease, their glances flicking often toward the horizon. Children sense what adults try to hide. Fear has a way of seeping into the bones of a place. Nieli carried that fear heavier than most. Her nights grew restless again, her shoulders tense, her eyes scanning the distance even as she tried to keep her voice steady for her daughters. She had lived too long under cruelty not to recognize its shadow when it returned. I saw her fight against despair, forcing herself to tend the garden, to mend clothes, to hum soft songs when the girls grew anxious. Yet in the quiet moments, when she thought no one watching, I caught the tremble in her hands. One evening, after finding another barrel toppled and tracks of boot heels leading away from the corral, I returned to the cabin with anger burning low and steady in my chest. Nieli was at the hearth, her daughters asleep beside her. She looked up as I entered, and in her gaze I saw the question she could not voice. How long before they take everything again? I set my rifle against the wall and sat across from her. The firelight flickered between us, drawing her face in lines of shadow and sorrow. "They won't break this place," I told her, voice low but certain. "Not while I draw breath." For a long moment she only stared at me, as though weighing whether to believe. Then she bowed her head, a tear slipping silent down her cheek, and whispered that she was tired of running, tired of losing. There was a strength in her words, not of defiance but of endurance, the strength of someone who had survived the worst and still stood. That night, for the first time, she did not wake alone from her nightmares. When the storm of memory broke her sleep, I was there, steadying her trembling shoulders until the shaking eased. She did not thank me, nor did I ask for it. Some bonds are forged not by words, but by the simple act of standing firm beside another. Days stretched into weeks, each marked by some new cruelty from the blackthorns. They came close enough to show themselves, riding along the ridges at dusk, their silhouettes sharp against the fading sun. They never entered the yard, never drew weapons, but their presence was its own violence. The girls clung to Nieli when the riders appeared, their small bodies pressed against her skirts as she held them close, whispering comforts she barely believed. One afternoon, as I repaired the corral, the brothers rode closer than before, stopping just beyond the fence line. The older one, Jeb Blackthorn, his name burned in Nieli's memory, called out with a sneer. His words dripped with venom, threats wrapped in mockery. He claimed the girls belonged to their blood, that Nieli's life was not hers to choose, that what I thought I had built here was nothing but borrowed time. I stood tall, hands steady on the rail I was mending, and gave him no satisfaction of anger. "This land's not yours," I said. "These lives aren't yours. Ride on." His laughter rang cruel across the dust, but beneath it I saw the twitch in his jaw, the sting of being denied where he expected submission. They rode off again, dust trailing behind, but the message was clear. They were not finished. That night Nieli sat long by the fire, her daughters asleep at her side. She turned to me suddenly, her voice rough with years of silence broken. She spoke of the day they cast her out, how they had called her unworthy, a burden, less than family. How she had begged not for herself, but for her daughters, and had been answered only with the crack of a whip and the slam of a door. Her words shook, but her eyes burned, and I saw then that her fear was twined with fury, the kind that comes from surviving the unforgivable. I listened, saying little, for my words could not unmake her past. But when she finished, when the silence pressed heavy, I told her what I knew to be true, that the desert was harsh, but it did not decide a person's worth, that she and her girls were not burdens, but blessings, the proof that even in a land of cruelty, life could endure. For the first time, her gaze did not carry only fear. It carried a spark, faint but fierce, as if my words had struck against flint long buried. The desert stretched wide and merciless around us, but inside that cabin, amid the shadows and the firelight, a different truth began to take root. The blackthorns might circle, might threaten, might scheme, but they would find no easy prey here. They would find resistance, quiet and unyielding, waiting for the day when silence would break into reckoning. The night the first shot was fired, the desert was too quiet. Even the coyotes held their tongues, as if the land itself braced for what was coming. I had grown used to silence, but this was different, sharp, brittle, the kind that carries the weight of threat. It came just past midnight. I was on the porch, rifle across my knees, eyes tracing the horizon where the moon threw silver over the scrub. The fire inside had dwindled to embers. Nieli and the girls lay in restless sleep. Then came the crack of gunpowder, sudden, shattering the night, and a bullet tore splinters from the post beside my head. I dropped flat, returning fire toward the ridge where smoke curled faint against the pale sky. Hooves thundered a moment later, and the blackthorns' laughter carried on the wind as they rode hard into the dark. Not a fight they wanted, only a warning, a message written in lead. Nieli burst onto the porch moments later, the girls clinging to her skirts, their eyes wide with terror. She saw the splintered wood, smelled the smoke, and knew without words that the storm she feared had broken. I told her to get the girls inside, to keep them low. My voice was steady, but inside I felt the weight of what was coming. This was no longer intimidation. It was war. The days that followed cut at us piece by piece. A heifer found dead in the dust, throat slit clean. The barn doors forced open, tools scattered and broken. Once, a fire set at the edge of the pasture, flames crawling quick through the dry grass until I beat them back with soaked blankets, the smoke choking my lungs. Each act was meant to bleed us slow, to show us that nothing we built was safe. The girls bore it in silence at first, but children cannot hide fear forever. One night I found the youngest curled beneath her blanket, whispering prayers that her mother would not be taken again. Nieli knelt beside her, tears shining in her eyes, and I knew the Blackthorns had already won one battle. They had stolen the girl's peace. That was a theft I could not forgive. I began reinforcing the ranch. Extra rails along the corral, traps laid near the arroyo, watch set every night from dusk till dawn. My body grew weary, but my resolve sharpened. The desert had taught me endurance, and now it demanded it again. Still, there are moments when endurance falters. One evening, as we gathered water from the well, the sound of hooves came sudden and close. I pushed Nieli and the girls behind the stone wall just as 3 riders broke from the mesquite, rifles raised. Their shots spat dust at our feet, their shouts cruel and mocking. I fired back, my aim true, and one of them cried out, clutching his arm as his horse veered wild. The others pulled him away, retreating into the scrub with curses, but their message was clear. Next time they would not aim to scare. Afterward, Nieli gripped my arm so tight her nails drew blood. Her eyes burned with fury brighter than fear. "They will not stop," she whispered. It was not a question, but a truth spoken into the night. I met her gaze and answered with the only promise I could make. "Then neither will I." That night we sat long by the fire, the girls asleep between us. Nieli's voice broke the silence, low but fierce. She spoke not of fear, but of resolve. She told me she would not flee again, not hide while her daughters learned to cower. "If they come," she said, "I will stand." And in that moment I saw not the woman cast out and broken, but the mother whose love burned hotter than any cruelty. The days turned harder still. We lived like soldiers, always watching the ridges, always listening for the beat of hooves. The Blackthorns circled like wolves, testing the fences, probing for weakness. Yet each time we endured. Each time they found us waiting, unbroken. But I knew the truth the desert whispered in the stillness. This would not last. The Blackthorns would not settle for harassment, not forever. They would come with full fury, with fire and steel, and when they did, the ground itself would decide who remained. For now, the ranch stood. For now, Nieli and her girls slept within walls that still held. But in the silence after the laughter of our enemies had faded, I felt the weight of what lay ahead. The Blackthorns were not just testing us. They were preparing for the day when intimidation would end and reckoning would begin. And so was I. The desert gave no warning. It never did. One moment the sky stretched wide and silent, the next it split with thunder of hooves and fire of gunpowder. It was near dusk when they came. I had been patching a section of the corral fence, sweat clinging to my brow, when the first shot rang out. The bullet hissed past my shoulder and buried itself in the rail. Before the echo faded, the ridges to the east swarmed with riders. 6, maybe 7 dark figures against the sinking sun. Their voices carried in cruel shouts, and the girls' screams tore through the air as they burst from the cabin. "Inside!" I bellowed, driving them back with a sweep of my arm. Nieli herded them quick, but she did not follow. She turned, skirts whipping in the wind, and stood by my side with eyes that no longer carried fear alone, but fire. The blackthorns charged. I dropped behind the trough, rifle braced. My first shot struck true, a horse rearing as its rider toppled into dust. Chaos rippled through their line, but the rest pressed on, firing wild. Splinters flew from the corral, bullets whining off stone. Nieli seized the pistol I had left by the post and knelt behind the fence. Her hands trembled at first, but when a rider broke close, she steadied, aimed, and fired. The shot clipped his hat clean off, startling him enough to veer wide. Her breath came ragged, but her gaze was hard, unyielding. For the first time since I had found her on that desolate plain, she was not only surviving, she was fighting. The girls huddled inside, their cries muffled by the cabin walls. I forced myself to stay steady, for their sakes as much as our own. Each shot I took was measured, each movement deliberate. This was not rage, it was necessity. The battle surged through the yard. One rider leapt from his horse and rushed the porch, knife flashing. I met him before he reached the door, my rifles but striking hard across his jaw. He fell, but another was on me quick, dragging me down into the dust. His weight crushed the breath from me, his blade scrabbling for my throat. Then, sharp as thunder, the crack of a pistol split the air. The man stiffened, eyes wide, before slumping lifeless atop me. Over his shoulder I saw Nieli, smoke curling from the pistol in her grip. She had saved my life. For a heartbeat we locked eyes, the world narrowing to that single truth. Then the chaos roared back, horses screaming, men shouting, guns blazing. We fought as one, two souls bound by necessity and something deeper that neither of us dared name. She covered my flank as I drove the riders back, her shots sharp and sure. I held the line where they pressed hardest. Each bullet I fired a vow. This land would not fall, these lives would not be stolen. At last, the blackthorns faltered. Their charge broke against our defense, their numbers dwindling, their fury turning sour with fear. Jeb Blackthorn himself reined his horse at the edge of the yard, his face twisted with rage. He lifted his rifle, aimed not at me but at the cabin where the girls hid. Time slowed. I moved without thought, throwing myself into the line of fire. The shot burned past my arm, searing flesh, but the girls were untouched. Nieli screamed, fury and terror mingling, and fired back. Her bullet grazed Jeb's cheek, drawing blood. He cursed, wheeled his horse, and the brothers fled into the gathering dark, their threats trailing on the wind. Silence fell heavy, broken only by the ragged heaving of our breaths. Smoke hung in the yard, acrid and bitter. Two of their men lay still in the dust. The rest had ridden hard into the night. Nieli rushed to me, her hands pressing against my wounded arm. Her touch was firm, steady, though her eyes glistened. "You're alive," she whispered, as though speaking it might make it true. I managed a grim smile. "So are you. So are they." The girls clung to her when she carried them out, their small bodies trembling but unbroken. They looked not at the blood, nor the bodies, but at their mother, the woman who had stood tall against the storm. And in their eyes I saw not only fear, but pride. That night we did not sleep. We sat by the fire, the children between us, the rifle across my knees. The desert outside lay silent, but we knew it was not over. The blackthorns had been driven back, but not defeated. They would come again, and next time with greater fury. Yet something had changed. Nieli was no longer only the woman I had found half dead in the dust. She was strength, she was defiance, she was flame against the dark. Together we had faced the storm and stood. The desert had tested us with fire, and though scarred, we had not broken. The reckoning was still to come, and when it came, we would be ready. The night after the attack, the desert lay heavy with silence. Not the brittle, dangerous kind that comes before violence, but something different, an exhaustion, as though even the earth itself had grown weary of blood. Smoke still lingered from the gunpowder, curling faint through the rafters, but the ranch still stood. We still stood. My arm burned where Jeb's bullet had grazed, a deep furrow along the flesh, but the pain was far away. What held me was the sight of Nieli kneeling at the table, sleeves rolled, hair falling loose from its braid as she cleaned the wound. Her touch was steady, practiced in the way of one who had mended her own pain too many times before. She did not flinch at the blood. She did not look away. "You were a fool," she said softly, though there was no anger in it, only fear disguised. "Throwing yourself before the girls like that." "They're children," I answered, my voice rough. There was no choice. Her hands stilled, the cloth pressed firm against my skin. When she looked at me, it was with something deeper than words, something that burned as fierce as the fire we had fought together. "There is always a choice. You chose them." I held her gaze, and in that silence I knew she was not only speaking of the girls. She meant herself as well. I had chosen them all. The children slept fitful in the loft, safe for now, though their dreams must have been haunted by the echo of gunfire. Nieli and I sat long by the embers, neither willing to close our eyes. We had both lived too long with shadows. It was in those hours that the walls between us thinned. She spoke of her past, not in detail, not yet, but enough. Enough for me to glimpse the chains she had carried, the cruelty she had endured, the way the Blackthorns had tried to strip her of everything human. She told me how, for years, she had believed escape impossible, that the desert itself had been kinder than any hand she had known. And then she looked at me, her eyes shining in the firelight. "But you came," she whispered, as though still unsure it had been real. "You came, and you did not turn away." I did not know what to answer, so I said the only truth I had. I couldn't. The desert outside stretched wide and endless, yet in that moment the world felt small, bound to the glow of the fire and the woman beside me. There was a closeness between us now that no silence could deny, forged not in gentle moments, but in blood and survival. Love, I realized, does not always bloom in peace. Sometimes it is born in fire. Still, the danger lingered. Every dawn I rode the fence line, searching for signs of the Blackthorns. Every night I sat watch, rifle in hand, listening for hoofbeats. They had been wounded, yes, but men like Jeb Blackthorn did not forgive, did not forget. He had tasted blood and been denied the kill. He would return, and when he did, it would be with fury enough to scorch the earth. Nieli knew this as well as I did. Yet she did not falter. She worked the ranch beside me, mending, gathering, preparing. The girls shadowed her steps, no longer quite children, but not yet hardened by the cruelty of the world. I saw in them something fragile yet unbroken, a testament to the strength their mother carried within her. One evening, as the sun bled red into the horizon, I found Nieli standing by the corral, watching the sky. Her hair caught the last of the light, a crown of fire around her face. She did not hear me approach until I was beside her. "They will come again," she said quietly. Not a question, but a certainty. "Yes," I admitted, "and it will be worse." She turned to me then, and there was no fear in her gaze, only resolve. "Then we will be worse too." Her words struck me with the force of a vow. This was no longer a woman I sheltered. She had become something else, partner, equal, flame against the night. The days that followed were filled with quiet preparation. Ammunition counted and cleaned. Barriers reinforced. Water drawn and stored. Each task carried the weight of what was coming, yet we did not speak of it more than needed. Words would not stop bullets. And yet, amid the grim work, there were moments, small, fleeting, precious. Laughter when the youngest spilled flour across the floor and painted herself white as snow. A touch of Nieli's hand against mine when she passed me the hammer. A smile shared across the table, weary but true. These moments, I realized, were why we fought. Not for land. Not for pride. For this, the fragile, fleeting taste of life unbroken. But the desert has no mercy for fragile things. One morning, as I rode the ridge, I found signs in the dust. Hoofprints, many of them, crossing from the east. Fresh. Too fresh. The blackthorns were moving, gathering. I returned to the ranch, my heart heavy with the truth I could not soften. Nieli read it in my face before I spoke. She gathered the girls close, her hand tight in mine. "They're coming, aren't they?" "Yes," I said. "Soon." The firelight caught her eyes, and for the first time she did not look away. "Then let it be soon. I am tired of running." And so it was set. The blackthorns would come with all their fury. The ranch would stand or fall. And in the heart of it, Nieli and I, bound not by chance, but by choice, would face the storm together. The morning came with fire. At first it was only the distant thunder of hooves, low and steady like the pulse of the earth. But soon the ridge to the east bled shadows, riders pouring over like a flood. Not 7 this time, nor 10, dozens. The blackthorns had gathered every hand, every vulture willing to ride for blood. Dust clouded the horizon, blotting out the rising sun. I stood in the yard, rifle tight in my grip, the girls huddled within the cabin. Nieli was beside me, pistol at her hip, eyes unflinching. She had braided her hair back, her face set hard as stone. This was no longer a woman escaping chains. This was a woman prepared to fight for the world she had begun to build. The first shots cracked across the plain, bullets striking the corral, splintering the fence I had mended only days before. Horses screamed. A lantern burst, flames licking across the hay. Smoke rose, acrid and black. The siege had begun. We fired back, the crack of steel against the roar of numbers. For every rider that fell, 2 more surged forward. They circled like wolves, howling, firing, breaking pieces of the ranch with each pass. The girls cried out from inside, but the cabin walls held. Jeb Blackthorn's voice cut through the chaos, cruel and certain. "This land dies tonight. The whore dies with it." Nieli's hand trembled at her side, but she did not falter. She raised her pistol, fired, and one of his men tumbled from the saddle. Her voice, clear and fierce, carried over the yard. "Then you'll have to bury me yourself." The men laughed, but it was a hollow sound. I saw their unease in the flicker of their eyes. She was not broken, not silenced. Still, the tide pressed harder. Flames spread across the barn, smoke choking the air. My shots came slower now, each one carrying the weight of inevitability. We could not hold forever. As the sky burned and the desert shook with the fury of hooves, I knew one truth with certainty. The storm had come at last, and before dawn, either the blackthorns or we would be ash upon this land. The desert screamed that night, flames and smoke twisting with the wind like living things. The blackthorns pressed hard, relentless, but we had grown sharper, steadier, unbroken. Nieli's eyes met mine across the chaos, and in them I saw not fear, but unshakable resolve. Together we moved, covering each other, each shot, each step a promise to protect what we had built. The fire consumed the barn, but we held the yard. Thomas and Nieli became a single force, moving as one, their actions instinctive. She fired with precision, each shot taking down a rider, each movement showing the strength born of survival. I fought beside her, my rifle steady, heart hammering with the weight of everything at stake. The blackthorns faltered, confusion spreading as their numbers dwindled. Jeb's rage twisted his face, and he charged toward the cabin, weapon raised, but Nieli met him with a shot that tore through the air. He reeled back, eyes wide, and the rest of the men, seeing their leader fall, broke in a tide of retreat. The desert swallowed them, dust and fury hiding their shameful flight. The fire died down, leaving the ranch scarred but standing. Smoke curled from the edges of the corral, the barn reduced to embers, but inside, the girls slept safe. Nieli and I, bloodied and exhausted, finally lowered our weapons. The world outside was vast, harsh, and unforgiving, but within the walls of our home, love had survived. We did not speak much at first. Words were unnecessary. The silence carried gratitude, relief, and something deeper, unspoken. Nieli's hand brushed mine, and the touch said more than 1,000 promises. Our children, our family, had endured the storm. By dawn, the desert returned to its usual hush. The blackthorns were gone for good, scattered and broken. We rebuilt slowly, patching fences, clearing the scorched earth, but the bond between us had changed something irrevocable. Thomas, Nieli, and the girls were no longer survivor and savior. They were family. And in that fragile, trembling, enduring life, the desert taught one last lesson. Even in the harshest, most merciless places, love can take root, grow, and bloom. Against cruelty, against fire, against despair itself, we had chosen to stand. We were unbroken. If you were in his place, would you have fought the same fight? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like the video. Explore the other stories waiting for you on screen, and discover more tales of courage, survival, and the unexpected heroes of the Wild West.